Dear colleagues and everyone joining us at today's session, greetings to you all. I warmly welcome you to the inaugural session of the SPARC webinar series. This is a special year as SPARC celebrates 15 years of service within and outside University of Colombo. What began with the launch of the INCAP study has now grown from strength to strength. The center has undertaken more than 25 research projects and has collaborated with more than 20 internationally and nationally renowned bodies. In addition, it has generated a revenue of more than 40 million rupees and has offered capacity building opportunities to more than 60 junior and senior academics to further expand their knowledge and develop their skills. The center has also undertaken timely projects. Two such examples are the recently concluded study which focused on online violence against children. This was the first of its kind in South Asia. SPARC is also involved in a project that focuses on the pandemic natural hazard hybrid scenario following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. It seeks to improve early warning and preparedness for such events and assesses the availability of and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information. Currently, there are other research projects which focuses on areas such as building resilience in tropical agro-ecosystems, integrating education with consumer behavior relevant to energy efficiency, and climate change and rebuilding communities after displacement. The outcomes of all our research projects have positively impacted policymakers, practitioners, academics, and lay people in different ways. This webinar series has been organized to commemorate the 15th anniversary of SPARC. It is my pleasure to introduce you to the speaker of our first session, Professor Hartmut Fünfgeld, who is currently a professor of geography at the Institute of Environmental Social Sciences and Geography, Albert Ludwigs University of Freiburg, Germany. Having completed a diploma in geography in 2002 and a PhD in human geography in 2006 from University of Heidelberg, Germany, Professor Fünfgeld has over a decade of experience in researching on climate change, sustainability, and local governance with the public sector and communities worldwide. He has also held many advisory roles and memberships in renowned committees and scientific councils. Professor Fünfgeld's academic career consists of lecturing and conducting seminars on human responses to climate change, development geography, urban governance and planning, energy transition, sustainability planning and management, and participatory and transdisciplinary research methods. Professor Fünfgeld has closely worked and has maintained strong links with SPARC over the years, and therefore we are delighted to have him speak at the inaugural session of the webinar series. Prior to starting the session, I kindly request all participants to abide by the following set of guidelines to ensure minimum disturbances during the session. Participants should keep their mics muted until end of the session. Please send any queries, questions via message. These will be reviewed by the team at SPARC and presented to the speaker at the question and answer session. We look forward to your cooperation in this regard. While thanking Professor Fünfgeld for his time and for sharing his knowledge, we hope that this session will be fruitful and beneficial to all participants. Thank you. Professor Hartmut Fünfgeld, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nishara, for this very kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? The audio is okay? Can you hear me good? Well?
Yes, yeah. Well,
right.
Yes.
Just want to make sure. If there's any trouble on the way, please let me know. Yeah, look, when Nishara wrote to me and asking me about this webinar series, I could not believe that SPARC is already 15 years old. I literally couldn't believe it. And I'm really glad to see also Professor Siri Hettike here today, who I've kept in touch with during my time in Australia. And yeah, it's great to be back here. And I feel very honored to be opening this webinar series. When I first joined SPARC, I think it was still called IMCAP. and that was in 2003. And since then, it's just amazing, has been amazing to see what has happened. And I've been following your developments and some of your projects on the website, and hopefully soon enough, I'll be able to come and join you again as well. It's about time, I thought, when I heard 15 years, I thought, whoops, I can't believe that has gone so quickly. So let me share my screen, first of all. Share my PowerPoint, let's do that. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so now, I hope you can see this. So I thought about what can I contribute from my end. As Nishara said, I've been working at the Institute of Environmental Social Sciences and Geography in Freiburg for the last 3 years. Before that, I worked for about 8 years in Melbourne, in Australia, in different capacities. And today I just thought I'll give you some insights into very current research that we're conducting in my working group at the University of Freiburg in Germany. And hopefully, although the talk will be rather conceptual, I hope that there are some bits for you to engage with in the discussion afterwards, and perhaps also relating to your own work in disaster risk management and climate change adaptation in particular. So I'm asking the question, climate change adaptation by whom and for whom? And by asking that question, I want to give some answers from the perspective of justice theory considerations, because I believe that this perspective, this angle of looking at justice theories is one that has been undervalued in academic research on climate change adaptation. So as a bit of background and perhaps as a starting point, I want to highlight five key issues that I'm sure you're familiar with, but I think it's a good point of departure for my talk here today. First of all, we all know that climate change adaptation has become a very urgent imperative for action across the globe. We know that at least since the IPCC reports, the assessment reports in 2007 and in 2014, we know climate change is having significant impacts across the world, and we need to act on it in the form of adapting to these changes. We have also seen a proliferation of global funds, and that's a good thing, set up to support climate change adaptation, in particular in the global south. You're aware probably of the UN Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. These funds have already committed billions of US dollars to adaptation, mostly to be used in the global south. As of 2019, the Adaptation Fund had received a total of $875 million US dollars in contributions. And of this figure, 875, a total of $605 US dollars had been committed to adaptation projects in the global south. So a significant amount of money that is administered here through the World Bank predominantly. The Green Climate Fund, which has been operating since 2010 and supports both mitigation and climate change adaptation projects, by 2019 had committed a total of $5.6 billion US dollars in projects, and of which 24%, that's about 1.3 billion US dollars had been committed towards projects exclusively aimed at adaptation. So we're seeing a massive change here, a massive dynamic. Adaptation has truly arrived on the international agenda, and it's been supported by multilateral funding schemes, very large funding schemes. We also are observing that in some countries, for example, in so-called small island developing states, climate change adaptation has become the core, the center of what needs to be done, or how development issues generally are being tackled and addressed. So we could say in these contexts, adaptation is much more than just an area of work or a new sector that is emerging. It's actually become a new paradigm for development cooperation overall. This is something that my colleague Silja Klepp and I are discussing in a paper that's currently under review. We've also seen, and this is the funding situation that I've just talked about is a result of that, significant and important debate at the international level about climate justice, about justices and injustice in the context of who is responsible for climate change in the first place and who is suffering its consequences most. But these climate justice issues, while they have been at the forefront of international debate, and for good reason, they are still very much underrepresented in research that focuses on local issues and also on local adaptation. Local adaptation, then, on the other hand, and this is a claim that I'm making based on observations of working in this sector for the last 10, 12 years or so, local adaptation continues to be seen as a largely technocentric process. It's guided by climate science. It focuses on biophysical impacts of climate change and then managing these impacts through a technical and sometimes technology-driven process. So this is the background against which I want to offer insights into the relevance of focusing on justice issues in this context. I don't have to tell you about these publications. I've done a bit of research and sort of looked at, for example, the report you see on the left-hand side by the World Bank to identifying South Asia's hotspots when it comes to climate change and changing living conditions. And you see on that map that I'm sure you've probably seen elsewhere, that Sri Lanka is considered a severe or moderate hotspots in all but the upcountry areas where it's considered to be mild, the overall impact. This is under a carbon intensive scenario for 2050. So we can expect significant challenges and significant adaptation challenges in this context. The National Adaptation Plan for Climate Change Impacts in Sri Lanka was published in 2016. I'm not going to tell you about it. I'm sure you know much more about it than I do. But what was interesting when I read through it is that this national plan does not mention the words justice or equity even once throughout the whole document. So that's just one of many examples where these issues around unequal, inequitable distribution of climate change impacts and of adaptation measures isn't addressed per se, isn't addressed directly. In Sri Lanka, of course, from my time in Sri Lanka, I know that there is a strong intersection in Sri Lanka between climate change impact and adaptation on the one side and disaster risk reduction on the other side, which I know SPARC is also working on, as Nishara just also highlighted. So perhaps this can be an area where we can connect to justice questions. What I want to talk about in the next 25 minutes or so is spatial perspectives on justice. I want to give you a quick overview of what that means. I want to then focus on what I would call the normative core of climate change adaptation, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that, and then offer a framework for justice-sensitive adaptation planning and also research. So when we think about justice in a spatial sense, and you know, I'm a geographer, so I like to think in spatial ways, or at least in socio-spatial ways, connecting the spatial perspectives with social issues. We can first of all look at this through the lens of distributive justice. And that goes back to some eminent scholars such as John Rawls or David Harvey, who have written about the distributional effects of processes in societies. When we look at distributional justice, that puts in the foreground spatial discourses around the construction, for example, of industrial plants, of waste dumps, or of other hazardous facilities, and then the consequential pollution of air, of water, and soil. This is something that was very dominant in the environmental justice movement in North America, in the US, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, for example. This distributional justice aspect has been very well researched, especially in the United States, where it has focused on analyzing spatial disadvantages of marginalized groups, often groups of immigrant background. And this was often done with the help of geographical information systems, so maps that displayed marginalization in a spatial sense, and, for example, significant exposure to hazards and to air pollution or water pollution based on markers, identity markers such as race or ethnicity or immigration status. This distributive perspective thinks about space as Cartesian space. So it's very much about how close are you related, how closely are you located to these environmental stresses and hazards, and what can be done to either keep them away from you, from wherever you live, or to distribute them more evenly across space. Another really important dimension, and an addition to this very much to this discourse that was very much focused on distribution, is the notion of recognition justice. That goes back to a number of scholars such as Nancy Fraser or Axel Honneth, who have written at length about this and very aptly about it. Here, it's not so much distribution and association or proximity to particular polluting places or hazardous places. It's very much about the cultural and institutional dimensions of disrespect, of humiliation, of marginalization and stigmatization that lead to an injustice or to injustices because people are not recognized for who they are and for what they would like to achieve. This could be in the North American context, for example, due to gender or sexuality issues, but also to ethnic origin, which we know plays a big role in Sri Lanka, for example, as well. Structural factors of marginalization, in this case, so structural things, societal structures, for example, lead to inequitable patterns of spatial distribution. So here it's the distribution also is a problem, but the main issue from a recognition justice is that people or different social groups are not equally recognized and thus not represented in political processes and in decisions. So here we're looking at space, not just as a container, like a territory or something along those lines, but rather as something that is socially constructed through identities, through people's identities, group-based identities. And then the third dimension is procedural justice and what could be called the justice of participation. There are many scholars who've written on this, for example, Iris Marion Young. Here, this is very much about to what extent can people participate in the democratic process? To what extent are they excluded from participation in decision-making? For example, when it comes to locating polluting industry or hazardous facilities. And in a procedural justice sense, whether they are included or excluded from such decisions is a reflection of power imbalances that exist in society and then lead to procedural disadvantages, to the fact that people do not have an option to participate, some groups. So in this case, space is considered as a political space, a space where power plays a big role, a space that's heavily contested and where negotiation needs to occur. And these three dimensions is what is often referred to as the Tri-Valent notion of environmental justice. And I've tried to sort of quickly outline not only what they mean, these three dimensions, this trivalence, but also sort of where they have come from, largely from a North American context. So now the question is, what does this all mean, and why is this relevant perhaps for climate change adaptation? Well, adaptation to climate change can reinforce existing forms of spatial and also social inequality. For example, this can happen by adaptation projects investing limited funds in areas of high economic value, such as in capital cities, or areas that are of high political interest, for example, certain economic zones within a country, while neglecting more peripheral areas, and also by definition, then also people who are living in these peripheral areas who might be socially and economically marginalized. Adaptation can also distort existing vulnerabilities and create new ones. So when the main goal of climate change adaptation is to reduce vulnerabilities, that doesn't mean that it is not, whether it's by accident or by design, contributing to new vulnerabilities. And this can have very profound impacts at the local scale, as a number of studies over the years have shown. So adaptation is not always beneficial for everyone. That's, I guess, a key point to be made here. And for these reasons, we have seen recently a significant number of calls that ask for greater consideration of equity and justice issues in adaptation planning. And this is something that my working group here in Freiburg in Germany, so my PhD students, postdocs, and I are working on, amongst other things, on the question of how can environmental justice perspectives contribute to an increased, a better understanding of the local, social and spatial effects of adaptation planning and implementation. So how can we use these justice perspectives? What can they tell us when we look at adaptation, and how can they help analyze these many adaptation projects that we're seeing around the world now? I want to come to what I would call the normative core of climate change adaptation. Adaptation, the way I have experienced it, and maybe you agree, and I think this also relates probably to disaster risk management in many regards, it's very much focused on functional issues, on functional questions. Namely, to summarize, you could say the main functional question that is relevant here is how can adaptation protect human life and maybe also non-human life forms from the impact of climate change? So typically when you talk to decision makers about what the goals of adaptation are supposed to be, they say, well, we want to adapt to climate change, we want to be protected or protect our people, our biodiversity, etc., from the impact of climate change. And if you break that down, like I've tried to do in that circle there in the middle, you can see that there are different ways of gathering data or thinking about how this functional question can be answered. You can do vulnerability assessments, you can engage in risk management, you can calculate the costs and benefits of adaptation measures. You need to identify feasible adaptation options, and of course then also find a way of implementing these, including finding funding for it. And this is all important and typical project management stuff. But what I think is missing from this picture is this normative core. So the fact that when we answer questions in this sort of light blue circle there, when we try to get data and make decisions in that light blue space on this slide, we are often forgetting or not registering that really a lot of these decisions are very much value-based. That is, they are normative. And really, maybe the question that we should be asking is what current and future options for sustaining human life in the context of climate change, and also, if you like, non-human existence, which of these options are we actually supporting by adaptation? And then it becomes very clearly a very strong politically charged choice that we're making. Another way of putting this more simply would be to ask who benefits from the goods created by adaptation, who benefits the good things that come out of adaptation efforts, and who suffers not only from the impact of climate change per se, but also from the bads, from the negative effects of climate change adaptation. So as I guess as an intermediate point here to make, anticipatory, oh, that's probably a spelling. I can't say that word right now. Anticipatory, probably, yeah, climate change adaptation requires value-based decisions. So we are always asked to check whatever we decide in a political process against our own values or against our societally grounded values. And these decisions will be about which kind of suffering is considered acceptable or tolerable under climate change, and for whom and by whom. So who will suffer and who's making the decision that these people can suffer, because we know that we cannot effectively adapt to all impacts of climate change in all places at the same time. So when we go back to this issue of distributive recognition and procedural justice, we then need to ask much more fundamental questions. Who should be protected from the impact of climate change, and what should benefit from the limited resources that are available from adaptation planning? And that then means we need to focus adaptation on individuals who are particularly vulnerable. And we also need to think about how the goods and bads of adaptation can be distributed more equitably. This is just looking at it from a distributive justice sense. Now, this is a message that has already clearly been heard and clearly arrived in international development contexts, on the agenda of large funding bodies such as UNDP here, UNDP Sri Lanka, which said in a recent publication, amongst other things, that it is focusing on empowering and increasing the climate resilience of the vulnerable populations like smallholders in Sri Lanka, etc., and so on. And now I'm not, I can't verify this. I don't have any research on UNDP Sri Lanka and the sort of projects they do, but this is just to state that in many ways, activities on adaptation in the global south have been much better than us, I say, here in the global north, at focusing on this issue of distributional justice by working more closely with the vulnerable. Of course, we then also have to ask who decides who is vulnerable, and which parts of vulnerable populations become close or have access to the benefits of such work. But that's something I can't answer. I just want to put it out there. Because I now currently mainly work in the global north, just to give you an example from Freiburg. Now, in Freiburg, we have a situation where we have the Black Forest next to us, like a mountain range that produces cool airflows in the middle of the summers. They can be very hot here, very hot for German standards anyway. And you can see on the top left a map that depicts one of these cool airflows from the mountains down into Freiburg. And here we've, on the right-hand side, you see two pictures of the same building, which actually is the central station, the main station in Freiburg. On the left-hand side, you can see that there was a gap left in this building. And one of the reasons this gap was left, it was that this cool wind from the hills that really cools down the city in the peak of summer, especially at nighttime, can flow through into the adjacent suburb of Stühlinge. On the right-hand side, you see that a local bank has decided to set up new headquarters and build a massive new building, which now blocks this particular architectural feature. And lots of local residents in the suburb of Stühlinge, which is where a lot of students live, are complaining or are challenging this on the grounds that they no longer have access to these cooling and fresh winds. Now, from a Sri Lankan perspective, this might seem like a very trivial problem to have, but it goes to show that distributional effects are becoming increasingly visible, not only in the context of looking at vulnerable or focusing on vulnerable populations, but also in the context of global north urban planning, if that's what we want to call it. So if we then move to recognition justice, we can ask questions about who should have a voice in adaptation planning. That's a question that's not very often asked. Who is even legitimized to speak on behalf of others who are not able to participate in the planning because they might not have the linguistic capabilities to do so, they might not want to participate, etc. So who's recognized? And here we need to focus, this is again looking at the normative aspects, on those locally most affected people who are so far not included in processes, but we also need to recognize historical and cultural practices and conditions that have led, that are impacting on adaptation planning. So for example, looking at a post-colonial setting, like in the context of Sri Lanka, and looking at people and social groups who are not recognized as much as others in this context is critical. And here I want to quote Karen O'Brien, who's one of the leading academics who has worked on this issue of value-based adaptation. She says in an article from 2017, social approaches to adaptation tend to focus on the underlying drivers of vulnerability, whether by improving social services and safety nets, increasing education and awareness, developing new economic instruments, providing insurance, or by identifying other policies and measures that specifically target the most vulnerable groups. And then she says, goes on to say, from this perspective, adaptation is about changing social relations and addressing historical injustices and contextual factors that then surface as climate change vulnerability. So in other words, not everything that we see as climate change vulnerability can be fixed by a technical or technocentric adaptation. We really need to address, when we think about recognition justice, at underlying drivers such as poverty and marginalization that we need to look into here. We did this in a project in Australia. Now, Australia, of course, is not a country that is has particular problems with poverty, by no means, but we do see very heterogeneous situations. For example, in rural Australia, people who have been very much affected by the impacts of prolonged drought in the farming sector. And we looked at how especially remote rural areas and the small communities that lived in this context or live in this context are affected through by mental health outcomes that are negative due to climate change, by financial losses that they endure, by the fact that suicide rates went up dramatically during this period of drought. And that's one way of trying to understand the contextual factors that even lead to climate change related vulnerabilities. Getting to the last point, procedural justice. Here we can ask who needs to be involved in making decisions as part of adaptation planning, and how can adaptation planning processes be open and as inclusive as possible. Here, of course, it's very much about creating real, tangible participation opportunities for those people who are affected by the impact of climate change and who are affected by any adaptation measures that are being taken. And also, and this isn't something that I know SPARC and before that IMCAP was very, has been very strong on, developing local capacities for adaptation planning and not letting adaptation planning be done in a purely expert-driven process using consultants, etc. So here, a PhD student of mine is currently examining, amongst other things, procedural justice issues. He's looking at the politics of resettlement in the Volta Delta in Ghana, in West Africa, the Volta Delta being an area that is affected by sea level rise due to climate change, but also significantly by environmental changes as a consequence of a large dam being built in the 1960s already, and people had to be resettled from a lagoon area inland, and he's looking at the processes that took place and how, to what extent or not, different social groups in this context were involved in the resettlement process. And I'm sure, well, I know and I assume that many resettlement processes after displacement are taking place in Sri Lanka. So this could also provide some insights there. We, my colleague Ben Schmidt and I have tried to discuss this in more depth in a paper that was published at the end of last year, which I'll give you the reference for. But essentially what we're saying is that you can look at adaptation in a very functional way, like on the left, in the left column here. But if you do that, then you might design very technical and technocratic processes and projects who really miss the point, because you never really ask the important value-based normative questions that you see in the middle column here. And then if you really want to change those underlying relations, economic, socioeconomic relations, and move towards something that could be called transformative adaptation, then you need to ask yet another set of questions, which we're trying to list here on the right-hand side. I won't go into them, but perhaps you're interested in some of this, and I can send you the paper as well. So just to sum up, I want to try to open up a framework that consists of these three dimensions: distributional justice, procedural, and recognition justice. And this is like one axis, I guess, if you like, of this approach or this perspective. And another axis that we've talked about, that I've tried to illustrate through those questions, is one that spans from, on the left bottom side, contextual vulnerability that is always relative to the vulnerability of other social groups, for example, on the one hand. So the, I guess, negative side, if you like, that adaptation is trying to address. And then on the top right, local adaptive capacities that can be developed if, and that can be supported through justice-based perspectives. And we've talked about these three different dimensions of space. Space just as a Cartesian, space as a container, as a surface in which we operate. And there are many different connections when you look at Cartesian space and justice issues. For example, there are a raft of uncertainties and knowledge gaps regarding the location or where climate change impacts will hit. We cannot fully know where the next extreme weather event, for example, is going to hit in that conception of space, but also spatio-temporal and socially differentiated vulnerability to the impact of climate change. So not only is there spatial differentiation, but also within a certain spatial area, within a municipality, for example, we know, of course, that there are very socially differentiated degrees of vulnerability. When we think about the political space that I alluded to at the beginning, the space of power and contestation, we know first of all that the resources for adaptation planning are limited, and thus they are contested. They need to be negotiated through a political process. And we also know that different groups, because of differentiated vulnerability, have different needs when it comes to adaptation. And when we look at this socio-spatially constructed space that focuses very much on how identities are constructed in this context, we see people with limited capacity who, because of their limited capacity, demand less say in adaptation planning. So they are much more silent in the whole process. They are not heard. And that also relates to recognition again. If you're not recognized as a social group, that automatically means you have limited participation rights. That sort of goes hand in hand by definition, so to say. On the other hand, the opposite is also true. If you're if you don't have procedural justice and you can't participate in processes, that means your non-recognition and lack of protection becomes amplified, becomes even worse. And at the same time, non-recognized people, of course, benefit less from adaptation measures and remain more vulnerable. And that's where the circle closes again, and we're back to square one, and we can see how this can become a perpetuating situation. So just as an outlook for opportunities for research that we're currently looking into, and I'd be very keen to talk to SPARC about where we could take this in the context of SPARC's work as well. From a theoretical and conceptual point of view, which is what I have focused in my talk here today, we are interested in a further conceptualization of the connection between adaptive capacity on the one hand and justice issues. And we're particularly interested, or I'm particularly interested in the capabilities approach that the way Martha Nussbaum developed that further. We're also looking more in the German and European context at planning theory considerations on justice issues in the urban context. Currently, I'm working on the extent to which urban resilience thinking has entered or is entering urban planning in Germany. But we also do, and this is quite important to me, quite applied and often transdisciplinary work, which I also started doing as a young PhD student in Sri Lanka, working with local agencies. Here we are currently working on two projects where we're examining the ethical and justice dimensions of municipal adaptation planning. So very hands-on planning processes, and we try to establish where ethical and justice concerns can actually be integrated into planning processes as part of adaptation, and also developing justice-sensitive approaches for adaptation in the context of international development. This is an area that we are increasingly working on. That brings me to the end, and I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over time. There are some references here. If you're interested in any of our publications and for whatever reason can't access them, please feel free to get in touch. This paper here is the main one that relates to my talk today. It's open access. It should be available in Geographica Helvetica on the internet. And that leaves me with my last slide. And I just want to say huge congratulations to, actually it's 15 years of SPARC, but I think with INCAP, we're probably at 20 years. Thank you very much. I dug up some old photos from the early days. I don't know if you know some of those people. I know some of them, of course. And thank you very much again for inviting me to opening up this webinar series here today. I'm looking forward to some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hartmut, for very conceptually sound lecture, and definitely, you know, this will give us, as you said, a lot of opportunities to, you know, engage in future research with SPARC. And I think I also, as Professor Hettige, I think he's here, and he's the one who you know, started SPARC, and then actually because of his untiring effort with Marcus Meyer, actually you know, helped us to you know, build this center, Social Policy Analysis Center. Earlier it was INCAP, and later we developed as a center called SPARC from 2005 onwards. So let me open the floor for questions. I think we can, I mean, there are a few, I mean, questions where I got from some participants, and also yes, Nuan, we can share the presentation with all the participants with the consent of Hartmut Fünfgeld. Hartmut, I hope that is okay, no?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yes. So before I ask any questions, I would like to ask our participants to ask any questions or comments, with regard to Hartmut's lecture. You can introduce yourself and then just ask the question.
Siri, I think, right?
Yes, sir.
No,
Yes, sir.
I don't want to ask any questions because there's so much to discuss based on what you presented, and I think we should leave it for a later date and time. But I think there's so much to be picked up from your presentation, and I think you provide a background against which a lot of these issues that we are confronted with should be discussed. So I want to just say thank you, Hartmut, for coming back to us after so many years. And it is really not in vain that we had, worked very hard over the last 15 years. There is institutional memory, and also there is continuity. And I think that's really what collegiality is all about. So thank you very much, Hartmut, and I want to thank you and also thank Nishara for bringing you back. And there are, dozens of people like you across the world. So I think we have a massive lineup of people who can really contribute to the development of this area of work in Sri Lanka and of course elsewhere. So I'm glad that you are here. Thank you very much, and I will certainly keep you posted. And I think let's keep things moving in the months and years to come, because we have no choice. I think we have come to a point where we just don't have much of a choice except facing the ground realities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I have to leave because I have another one coming up at actually Monash University has another event at 4 o'clock, so I'll leave. Sorry that I'm not leaving because of anything else. I'm leaving
fine,
because
no
I have
problem
to
at
join
all.
the Monash group now. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Siri. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
your
sir.
kind
Thank
work.
you. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Looking forward to keeping in touch. Thank you so much.
Absolutely,
Yeah. I think there is a question posed. The question is, in your opinion, the role of advocacy in the environmental justice discourses on climate change adaptation.
Mm-hmm. What is the role of advocacy?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's I'm glad someone's asking about this, because when you look at environmental justice, you can look at it, and I think we are doing it, and so certainly that's what I'm trying to do. Look at it as from an analytical perspective, as like trying to work out what can an environmental justice perspective add on to existing discourses and debates and processes in the space of climate change adaptation here. But we have to remember that environmental justice was initially a social movement, much more than an academic agenda. And I quite personally, although it's sometimes difficult to navigate this advocacy side of environmental justice, I do think it's very timely to think about academic perspectives and academic theories, not only as something that is like purely academic in the pure sense of the word, but also something that relates very strongly and resonates strongly with certain groups of people. And I think these days, when we're trying to tackle the big challenges like climate change, for example, being one of them, we have to get the people involved. The people are already involved. Just think of the Fridays for Future movement, which is very big here in Europe. I'm not sure how you are noticing it in South Asia. The people are already demanding this. So I think that's one of the strengths of an environmental justice perspective, that it's both grounded in advocacy and plays a big role there. But it also, if you delve deeply into it, it provides, through the perspective of these different dimensions of justice, provides some really important insights, I think, that we can employ to better understand how adaptation and other processes are occurring.
Let me move into the next one. The next question is, do you think community-based approaches have a role to play in ensuring justice, particularly procedural justice in climate change adaptation?
Absolutely. I think one of the strong facets of adaptation in an institutional sense has been community-based adaptation. But of course, there also we have to be careful, I think, to ask the critical questions of what does community-based actually mean? Who's really involved in the community-based adaptation process? And most importantly, and this is why it's not just about distribution, who's recognized, going back to my talk, who actually even has a say in it? Is it just the fact that the community members are, I say it in a bit of a provocative way, used to plant mangrove seedlings, for example, and they get paid for it, or they even worse, they don't get paid for it? Or is it something that really is driven by the community or by members of the community? And of course, from a sociological point of view, Nishara, you know much better than I, when you look at a community, there's no such thing as a community. A community is very heterogeneous. There's lots of different political interests at play. There's internal power struggles, etc. So it's not as simple, but I do think that overall, the sort of more bottom-up perspectives on adaptation, and especially when it involves decision-making over how funds are spent, have the potential to be more just than many of the top-down approaches that we have seen. But even there, I think even in community-based adaptation, we can use justice perspectives to better understand the power struggles that are going on at the local scale.
Thank you. Any other questions that you would like to, pose to Professor Hartmut? You can just. Yeah, one last question now, Hartmut. When it comes to adaptation, it's very important for us to explore the concept of politics of adaptation. Because countries like, Sri Lanka, right? So politics play a, very major role. So when it comes to even, as you said, relocation, community-based, approaches, always we discuss about, politics of relocation, politics of adaptation, politics of disaster risk reduction. So what is your opinion on this? I think, this plays a very important role in adaptation.
Yeah, I think it's only, and I probably, my impression from, it's a while that I was really deeply immersed in the work in Sri Lanka, doing my PhD, but my sense was and still probably is that not only do politics play a significantly large role in Sri Lanka, but also that there are a number of people in the academic sector who are very aware of these politics and who are examining them, including some of you. So that's a strength, I think, generally speaking. And I sometimes look at our research here in Europe or in Germany, where I think like no one is talking about the politics. People just look at adaptation as this kind of like neutral planning process, urban planning taking place, like I said in this example of Freiburg, and only gradually are we hearing more critical voices or more aware voices that say, hey, hang on, this is quite political, what's happening here? Why have we not been consulted on this? So I think the politics of adaptation is something that is really only just starting to be researched at this local scale. I think the global politics of adaptation has been studied and discussed for 20, 30 years, right? But when we look at projects, and also in particular when we look at what is now being done under the guise or under the umbrella of adaptation, which is generally understood as being a positive and benevolent thing, right? Well, we need to deal with climate change impacts, we need adaptation. I think we still have a long way to go to better understand the politics, and that's partly what I'm driven by, to really look at projects and initiatives more closely and say, hang on, what sort of political processes and power contestations can we examine, can we identify here? That doesn't mean that you can solve the politics, but you can at least point out to maybe some discrepancies. Right?
Yeah. Thank you. So with that, I think we will conclude the session. On behalf of SPARC, Hartmut, I would like to thank you because you already accepted our invitation, and I know that you're busy, but but you agreed to deliver the lecture, and which you did, so we would like to continue our friendship and also research partnership in the future, and so hopefully that will benefit both parties. Thank you for your time, Hartmut. Yes.
Thank you so much, Nishara. 2 years ago, I had discussed with my colleagues in Freiburg that this year in 21, I would like to do a student field trip to Sri Lanka with our geography students. But then Corona came and some other things around security related travel restrictions, and we decided it wasn't possible. But it's been on my list for a long time to reconnect and to also come back to Sri Lanka. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity, and my apologies for the at times very slow response, which has to do with semester-based workloads. But it's been a pleasure to join you in this digital way. Like this is one of the good things about Corona, that we can do this now. And I have very fond memories of my time at SPARC, and everyone who's here today, I can only encourage you to keep supporting SPARC and keep working the way you are and you have been. It's been terrific.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you. I would like to thank all the participants on behalf of SPARC, and we will also see you in our next webinar. We will also inform the presenter and the title. So thank you, Hartmut. Thank you.
Thank you. Best wishes to Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.